and then
Okay.
yep, and that's off.
That's a good old bobber. It's off now.
Ugh. Is it? Am I winning for the people outside? No, for something. Yeah, that's pretty good time. What's that? Hey, I don't know program. I don't know. Colleagues, welcome. Thank you very much for coming out on what's turned out to be a rather cold winter evening. And thank you in particular for coming out, even though unfortunately the minister or his PA emailed us this morning to say that he's fallen ill and was unable to be here, despite having a captive audience. So we're going to proceed regardless, because I think the issues, some of you got the captive joke, the issues are nonetheless, I think, extremely important, and I think we have a really good panel that's going to give you all stuff to think about, but it also means that without the protocols, without the minister and all the rest of the stuff that we normally have to go through, there's much more time for you to be able to ask questions, and that's really where we want to try and get to as quickly as we can. So hurry these speakers along. I'm told for anyone younger than me, if you want to, you can tweet on #RET debate. I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it'll make you very happy. I don't know how you do those things. Let me say also, while the Minister is not here, that also means that the European Union is not funding this event. They were on the invite, but they only fund government to government, and they asked us to put in the disclaimer in case this becomes something that they would not necessarily be part of. But let me please start by acknowledging some important guests that are in the audience. We're very honored in this school to have, as a visiting research fellow, the former Speaker of the National Assembly, Max Sisulu. We're also joined by former Finance Minister, Mr. Trevor Manuel, and from the Oliver and Adelaide Foundation, we have the grandchildren, Zachary and Theodora Tambo, who have also joined us this evening. So thank you to them. We will have a couple of words about the O.R. Tambo Foundation in a second, but so you understand, these debates are hosted by a partnership between the Wits School of Governance, the O.R. Tambo Foundation, the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, and the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And I think what we try and do in these debates is pay tribute to O.R. Tambo's attributes as a social justice advocate, a strategic thinker, and particularly a debater. Someone who's not afraid of being confronted with things he doesn't agree with and takes them on as they are and deals with them. And I'm hoping that's what part of what will come out of this evening. I think the UNDP is important for playing a crucial role in providing technical knowledge and expertise by bringing international best practice perspectives and support for this series and for government as a whole. The DPME, of course, plays a vital role in ensuring that recommendations and other outcomes of this series of debates, are adequately considered in policy-making circles of government. And it'll be interesting to see what happens tonight and what that does to radical economic transformation. I think the point that we're trying to make is that these debates that we host are not done just for the sake of it. They're normally anchored in the National Development Plan, or they're not normally, they are anchored there. And the point is to say, are we following the NDP at all? And the question we were asking tonight is, how does radical economic transformation relate to the NDP? Does it at all relate to the NDP? Does the NDP make any nod in the direction of radical economic transformation, or are they poles apart? And these are merely questions meant to try and get you thinking, but I think that's really the critical angle we come from. And let me say very clearly, when I say critical, I mean it in the best possible sense. The fact that the minister fell ill meant that we simply carried on. This is a university, we're here to debate, we're here to engage. We'll obey some rules of courtesy and asking brief questions. But beyond that, the floor will be open, and anyone who catches my eye will be invited to speak. So please do sit back and enjoy. I'm going to start by asking Mr. Duma Nkosi, the former mayor of Ekurhuleni, if he would come up and say a couple of words about the Tambo Foundation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe the first point one would like to raise, just to say, as a member of the party of Oliver Tambo, the situation I'm in now will be largely a bit uncertain, a bit conflictual, and I would be seeing a bit of disunity. I hope it makes sense. But on the other side, I think coming here today, we are the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. Because I could see that lots of colleagues refer to O.R. Tambo Foundation. The emphasis of being able to look at the couple and maybe both comrades, to put it correctly, is that they actually played significant roles. Both of them, for the city of Ekurhuleni, they have been actually given the freedom of the city of Ekurhuleni, both Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, as well as Chris Hani. They are free people of the city of Ekurhuleni. We have taken a view as the foundation to look at this year as 2017, 100 years. Birthday is 27 October this year. Earlier on in the morning today, we had a countdown from 100, looking at the birthday SABC had 4 national radio stations looking at a point of who is it that we're talking about. So the foundation has confirmed the theme, which reads, "On the Shoulders of a Giant." And on our part, we think we should be able, this year particularly, because it's his centenary year, to honor the legacy, but we want to confirm that it's of a seminal figure in the history of the liberation struggle of South Africa, hoping that we can be able to actually express ourselves to the immense contributions to the ANC particularly, and the establishment of our democracy. We're hoping that we can be able to record, share, and have same understanding of the kind of role he played. We're hoping that we can be able to document and learn from values, skills, and practices of Tambo's work life. And on our side, we still believe all those principles, skills, or practices are still relevant today. We hope to use the legacy to stimulate debate, research, education, and action that can help us resolve the long-standing challenges we face as a country. Socio-economic upliftment and education of the youth and women, and the promotion of arts and culture and heritage initiatives. We're hoping that we can be able to do that. Program Director, I think as a person, we were trying to get words together to explain on how we see him, or we saw him as a person. We see him as a person that was serving, selfless, a person that did a lot of sacrifice. It's a person with huge personal integrity, honest, a person with mutual respect, a person who has humility. We know there's a lot of Christian principle that drove him, but we know that has helped him to be able to be responsible and responsive. Further, we think he did like the internal debates. We also understand that he did criticize and self-criticize. But what we know very well is that he was able to listen and ready to engage in a way of finding solution to challenges that he was facing. But further, I think for all of us, he has been a person who was very focused in ensuring that there's unity and collective leadership. I think in few words, just to explain on how we see him, we think we can say without contradiction that he was visionary. We can say he was an internationalist and also strategic. We are actually able to confirm as well that he was a leader that was open and approachable, exemplary, and led from the front. Serious hard worker. The last point, Program Director, one would like to raise just to say he did, I actually tried to get very good English words. He was unequivocal in the repudiation of any form of factionalism, corruption, patronage, and greed. How does that sound?
Thank you very much. Theodora, you were acknowledged before you arrived, and I'll do it again now that you have arrived, so welcome. Colleagues, I'm going to do protocol very quickly because we don't have to do lots of protocol because the minister's not here. So let me quickly introduce the panel, and then we're going to go. Okay, so first up we're going to have Professor Pandi Pillay, who wrote the background paper, which I hope you all received on the email, those of you who RSVP'd. In that paper, you'll see my name's attached to it, so all the good bits I wrote, and the rest of it Pandi wrote, fairly obviously. He's our senior professor of economics and public finance here at the school. He was previously head of the policy unit in the Office of the President and executive director of the Financial and Fiscal Commission. He's published widely. He's worked in Bangladesh, Egypt, Kenya, Iran, Lesotho, Namibia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia. And got his PhD from, gosh, an obscure university somewhere in the other end of this country. I shan't, never mind. I can't I'm battling. Duma, can you help me? Cape Town, I think that says. Next up is my boss, but not for tonight. The Dean, Professor Imran Valodia, who's the Dean of the CLM faculty, that's Commerce, Law and Management. He's a well-known economist. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. And works on competition policy in the Competition Tribunal. He's led and participated in a number of large national and international studies. You probably know him better at the moment. He was appointed by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa to chair the advisory panel that developed the proposal for a national minimum wage last year. And you'd have seen Imran all over the TV. I would like to note, please, that there are 2 women on the panel, and there were 3 when we set it up. The third was called to London on a business meeting, a private sector. I mean, she was representing business. So I'd just like to note the gender point. So my colleague, Dr. Karen Abrams, is a senior lecturer here at the School of Governance. Before joining us here, she was at the Gauteng City Region Observatory, where she focused on social cohesion, anti-racism, urban inclusion, and urban food systems in Gauteng. She's published on most of those topics as well, and she's got a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Niva Mekhetla over there, about whom I'm going to say one thing that she hates me saying, because her twin sister did tell me. She got into Harvard when she was 16. Woo! I show off on my panelists' behalf in the hope that they do me favors later. Niva's a senior economist at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. In other words, she is a senior person at TIPS, put it that way. She used to be DDG in economic policy in the Economic Development Department from 2010 to 2014. And before that, she worked for the Presidency, the DBSA, and COSATU, as well as various other government departments. Before 1994, she worked in various universities in Africa and in the United States. Her research centers on aspects of industrial policy and value chain analysis, and on socioeconomic challenges facing South Africa, especially around employment creation and inequality. So there you have the formalities. What we'll do is Pandi will talk and basically talk to the background paper, after which each of the panelists will have 10 minutes max, and I'm going to be rather fascist about that, to do their inputs. If there are any questions, particularly those framing questions that haven't been answered, I may ask a couple of questions of them, and then it'll be over to you. Okay, does that sound fair? Pandi, it's all yours.
It's working? Thank you very much and good evening. I was comfortably sitting on the substitutes bench and was pulled off that bench when the minister pulled out. So I'm not part of this really auspicious team here. You know, I just brought on as a substitute, but be that as it may. I'd like to begin with the point that I make in the paper, that how far South Africa has moved in altering the economic landscape is quite open to debate. I think no one will disagree that it has certainly moved, but the important questions are how far has it moved, at what speed has it moved, and at what point will the monopolistic tendencies in the South African economy be challenged? And this seems to me to be a very key point of the debate. But it is equally pertinent to ask, I think, at this point in time, if the policy emphasis on economic growth has been misplaced. The implicit assumption here being that if the economy grew at a sufficiently high rate, it would somehow take care of the psychosocial impact of racism, violence, and spatial dislocation created by apartheid. I think it would be dishonest to deny that much has been achieved in many areas. Meeting basic needs, mechanisms for enhancing social cohesion, and so on. But a notable omission, in my opinion, in the list of developmental successes relates to the post-1994 economy. For the democratic period as a whole, economic growth has been singularly anemic. Unemployment has been rising consistently, income inequality has been worsening, but poverty alleviation, to some extent, has been addressed, certainly on the most conservative measures of $1 and $2 a day. And I think the relative lack of progress on the economy has occurred in of a plethora of national policy documents, the most recent of which, as you know, has been the National Development Plan. Now, the projections that are hugely problematic. Now, if you look at the present time, NDP might actually appear quite a radical document. However, the real crisis in South Africa at the present time are somewhat obscured by the political crises of recent months. And this political crisis, in my opinion, has provided an opportunity, amongst other things, for mainstream economists to reinforce the need for fiscal discipline, quote unquote, as if that is the only factor stifling growth and development in our country. In business and in some parts of government, economic policy is essentially reduced to the maintenance of macroeconomic stability. Fiscal discipline, and I would add political stability, are clearly important preconditions for economic growth, but they are clearly not enough. One of the really important questions that needs to be addressed in the debate about economic transformation is the question of who is in charge of economic policy in this country. For me, it has been evident for some time that the private business sector in South Africa leads on economic policy and the government follows. And I think it is clearly time for government to reverse this and to take charge of economic policy, including macroeconomic policy, so that the country's real development needs can be addressed. Achieving growth rates of 2 to 3%, which seems to be the limit of our ambitions at the moment, may be adequate for the private business sector and the top 10% of the South African population. But it will not deliver higher levels of more inclusive growth to address the important challenges of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. In fact, growth of such modest proportions will serve to accentuate inequalities in the country, with the rich yet again apportioning to themselves a highly disproportionate share of the fruits of economic growth. At the same time, I would like to add that if radical economic transformation is to serve the needs of the bottom 60% of the population, it really needs to move beyond the catchy and convenient political slogans of nationalizing land, banks, and mines, and kicking out white people. It requires indeed a rigorous analysis of why economic and social policy have not delivered growth and development. And in the paper, we set out some ideas on how we can attempt to build a more equitable and inclusive society. And I will briefly discuss these 5 or 6 points. The first is to reiterate the point that government must take charge of economic policy. And I think it's really important to reiterate and reinforce the point that government must take charge of economic policy rather than being subservient to the private business sector, the credit rating agencies, the World Bank, and the IMF. Secondly, I think there's an urgent need to expand industrial policy. Industrial development, as we know, is a key driver of economic development because it is considered as a solution to overcome, amongst other things, commodity dependence. Now, in spite of being a late starter on industrial policy, much progress has been made already in this regard. However, much more can be done with increased funding for much needed growth and greater diversification of the manufacturing sector. Thirdly, there is the notion of how can we develop small business. Almost everyone agrees that small business has to be a critical component of any development strategy. However, as we know, this sector has been characterized by a singular lack of success in terms of either sustainability or employment. We need to move away from this widely accepted notion that the most important challenge to the development of small business is government funding or lack of it. Rather, we should ask why so many small businesses are failing in spite of considerable funding by the IDC and other institutions. It seems to me that a much more important issue here is the exploitation of the small business sector by big business. One needs only to examine the history of the large supermarkets and their ruthless exploitation of small suppliers, as recent investigations have demonstrated, and the differential treatment of large and small businesses by shopping mall owners, to get a sense of the highly unequal and hugely exploitative relationships that currently exist in virtually all sectors of the economy. Under these circumstances, it's incredibly difficult to ensure the development of small business. Fourthly, breaking up monopolies and cartels. As is well known, the South African economy is characterized by the excessive concentration of economic power in the hands of a tiny minority of the population. Large conglomerates now dominate production, distribution, and the financial sectors. In addition, there's a high degree of monopolization and blatant anti-competitive tendencies, such as predatory pricing and interlocking directorships. However, and very fortunately, one of the most progressive features of South African economic policy post-1994 has been the development of the competition architecture, comprising in particular legislation that established the Competition Commission and the Competition Tribunal. Sterling work has been done by these institutions to expose collusion, particularly with respect to price setting. But we know that the Commission and the Tribunal are seriously underfunded. Much more funding is needed here to provide these institutions with the resources that they need. Fifthly, ensuring real black economic empowerment. It goes without saying that black economic empowerment needs to progress beyond the elite few who are closely linked to the ruling party. Sectors such as tourism provide opportunities for creative thinking about new forms of ownership that are more innovative and beneficial to a greater proportion of the previously disadvantaged population. Sixth, building the developmental state. Given the current political climate, there's a great deal of skepticism about the potential of the developmental state, particularly in the light of the pervasive governance and fiscal crisis afflicting important parastatals such as Eskom, SAA, SABC, Denel, etc., to mention a few. However, there is no alternative to the developmental state. We cannot leave economic development to the South African private business sector, whose immense wealth has been built on the misplaced notion of the free market and the exploitation of cheap labor. This is the only model that South African capitalism knows. For the developmental state to be effective, however, it has to be competent. Or in the language of the NDP, it has to be capable. And there is much to be learned also from the international experience on the developmental state, and it is important that South Africa absorb these lessons, whether they are from Asia, Scandinavia, or Latin America. Now, in conclusion, what we see in South Africa at the present time is an obsession on the part of both the private sector and the government with macroeconomics as an article of faith. Such provide the 2 to 3% growth rates that these constituencies strive for. But it will not deliver growth of the magnitude and type that is needed to address South Africa's developmental challenges. At the same time, building the developmental state does not imply a return to yesterday's socialism of state control of the means of production. Rather, we should focus on an appropriate mix of roles for the state and the business sector, with the state as the driver of development, coupled with truly competitive markets producing goods and services. Radical economic transformation is more than just political posturing on issues such as white monopoly capital. Rather, it should be about addressing the real challenges of sustained growth and development. Thank you.
In the paper, but we've added a few the first time. So one of them is obviously what's radical in radical economic transformation? How do you define the radical? What does it mean? What are the component parts of it? How do we make the move from where we are, which is stagnation, recession, into a radically transformed economy? You can't say we will do that through RET if you're not able to define what RET is and what the components are that will move you from one place to another. So what are the elements of that radicalism that will actually help us make that jump? I don't think anyone is really arguing that we don't need some kind of change. And I think it's important that in the current political mess that we're in should not obscure the importance of the need for radical economic transformation. And I think the danger of it is that it's so associated with the current very unpleasant politics, is that the whole notion of radical economic transformation is liable to be seen as the product of one part of the ANC, and therefore it can be labeled and put away and ignored, and it can be business as usual elsewhere. I think we have to de-link it from the party politics at the moment. I think there is also the broader question that we are heading into, we keep getting told, the next industrial revolution, in which there will be no more blue-collar jobs, there'll be no more white-collar jobs, there'll only be what they call new-collar jobs, which is economists speak for, we've got no idea if anyone will have a job. But with automation and the rest taking over, you really have to worry that we're still stuck in a mindset of extractive industries and industrialization, and automation is taking over. What is going to happen to the already staggering level of unemployment that we're suffering from? And very finally, the point that we alluded to in the paper, which is, can you really talk about radical economic transformation in isolation from radical spatial transformation? It's still a 24-kilometer drive from here to the center of Soweto. It doesn't matter how you play the game. You're still locked in racially, not entirely racially, but very largely racially defined areas that apartheid created for us, And people still live there in the same communities they did before. Some of the more affluent may be deracializing, but the poor sure ain't. So what do you do about that? Even if we got 10% growth and lots of jobs, is it really going to transform the townships? And if it doesn't, what are we doing to break those barriers? The barriers are there by design. The highway between us and Soweto, it's not accidental. It was designed to keep them away from us, remember? I mean, that's the whole point of spatial segregation. And then we've got the, can you do economic and spatial without dealing with radical social transformation? Look at the intensity of the racial debate right now. Look at the way in which everything is immediately racialized. Whether it deserves to be or not is up to you. But the intensity of that debate tells us that we have not moved anywhere near far enough to even acknowledging the problem, let alone finding the solution. And we tend to think if the economy works and people get jobs and their dignity is somehow restored, social stuff will kind of follow. Well, I think these few inches here are not being fixed by economic change or the lack of. They need going to be solved by economic means. And so this will all be sorted out now by our last three panelists in remarkably short time. So we'll start with Imran, go on to Karen, and end with Neva.
So my task was to kind of respond to the minister's talk, and it's a little hard to do that when the person's not in the room and you're not sure what he said. So let me start with a few thoughts to just frame things. Firstly, I want to make quite clear that as far as I'm concerned, all of this talk, the way that the RET sort of conversations being had by certain parts of the sort of country, and that goes all the way to the head of the state, is nothing but an excuse to loot. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about that. Kind of having said that, I do think that there is a kind of need for us to kind of radically rethink what type of economic program we should have. And I say that because for many of us who were thinking about what the post-apartheid economy would look like in the 1980s and the kind of early 90s, I think the country that we had in our mind, that we thought we were building, was something that was might be aligned with Sweden. So we were thinking we were going to sort of build a social democratic country where we would have consensus, where we would have growth, where we would increase our exports, and that was the vision in our minds. And I think if we don't start to deal with some of the problems, it's likely that we might end up like the DRC. And I don't say that the kind of DRC to kind of demean what the DRC is like, but I think we could end up being a sort of country where we sort of fighting for resources, and we caught up in sort of battles that are not going to get us kind of out of the problems that we have. So for me, any policy around kind of radical economic transformation, I think, has to deal with two things. And I disagree with sort of Pandi on the first point. I think economic growth has to be at the kind of absolute center of anything that we're going to do from here on. So I kind of think his paper underplays that, and I think it has to be at the kind of at the forefront of it. But I think that kind of economic growth has to deal with two real issues, and that's firstly that we've got to deal with the levels of inequality in our in that the path that we're on has generated increasing inequality, and I think we have to deal with that. And I think we've got to deal with the ownership issue. And for me, those two issues have to be the way that we transform the economy to get us onto a new growth path where we're going to get the sorts of economic growth rates that we should. So that is all like a, you might say, who doesn't want economic growth? So let me share with you three kind of broad sets of ideas about how I think we could get to growth that would deal with the kind of problems of ownership, and which could deal with the problems of inequality. So my first set of thoughts is kind of related to the state and to government. And I think here again, maybe Pandi and I are not quite on the same page. I think we talk a lot about white monopoly capital. I think it's about time we start we start talking about the problems of state monopoly capital. Let me give you two examples. I think what Eskom is doing to us is something that we should be completely furious about. What Eskom's doing is to take our money and throw it down the tubes. I think it's about time we confronted the fact, and I think it's the perfect time to do it. So if I were the finance minister, I think the first thing I would do is stop thinking. I'd be here in the first case. Yeah, true. The first thing I'd do is to start rethinking the whole question. The whole question of state-owned enterprises. I think Eskom has to be broken up. You can't have a large power utility such as the one that we have that deals with both the generation of power and also the transmission of power. We have to break those two up, and that's because Eskom, in that setting, kind of all of its incentives are to look after itself and to not deal with what we need in the energy space. Let's take another example, SAA. We pouring billions into SAA. I can't understand what's the reason for SAA to be owned by the state and why we should continue to subsidize it. You kind of hear the argument that we need a state-owned airline because a private airline isn't going to fly some routes which we have to have flown. Well, what we have with SAA doesn't fly between Durban and Cape Town. It doesn't fly between the second and the third largest cities within South Africa. What is the argument for us to pour money into SA? So I think we've got to really think about what's the role of state-owned enterprises and how it ties in with the issue of where we're wanting to go. I have 2 minutes left, and I've just started to warm up. So let me move on. I think it's quite easy for Pandi to business, and I mean, anyone who has looked at the amount of sort of cartels will know that every basic item that we eat, bread, look at wheat, the sort of bicycles that you ride, everything is those prices sort of come out of a cartel process. And I kind of really think business has to come clean on these things. But I don't think we should necessarily point at, it's kind of our futures are tied up with big business. I think we should have large enterprises. We should have enterprises that can compete on the international scale. For me, the issue isn't whether the enterprises are big or not. The question is, do they abuse their sort of power? And I think we have to be clear. If you're abusing your sort of power, then you have to deal with it. And I think a great example playing out now is the abuse that Google has just had to deal with. So the kind of future of the economy is about large firms that are innovative. We kind of have to promote them, but there is a point where they cross that line and they start to abuse their sort of power, and at that point we have to deal with it. And you'll be pleased to know that the EU has just found Google 2 billion euros. It's the largest fine ever because it's abusing its power. And I think our laws need to be adapted to allow us to deal with that. Third point, well, I want to just share this slide with you. It's not my slide, it's Simon Roberts' slide. This shows you our economic relationships to the rest of the world from 1994 to now. So throughout the period of our transition. And what's striking about the picture is that our economic relationships with the rest of the world haven't changed. So that blue bar is our minerals exports. Throughout this time, we simply haven't been able to adapt the economy in a way which would shift us away from a reliance on the export of minerals. So for some part of this time, we had great fun when mineral prices were high, but what we did is we consumed it all. We spent all of the money, and in kind of throughout our transition years, we haven't been able to promote exports of manufactured goods. And I think it's kind of really something we have to deal with. Two last points on social issues. I think we've got to deal with earnings, and we have to deal with the enormous inequality in earnings. So you won't be surprised to know that I think the national minimum wage is a fantastic first step in along that path. But I think we have to deal with the incomes of those at the sort of top end of the distribution as well. I mean, it seems to me we sort of simply can't allow and we can't justify the sort of top CEOs earning the amounts that they do. People earn hundreds of millions of rand a year, and that just seems to me to be unacceptable. I think one part of this story has to be kind of addressing issues of gender. I think we live in the belief, and we've kind of throughout this time, in every sort of document you read, we think we're going to create jobs for all South Africans in the short term. I think we have to admit that that isn't going to happen, and I think it's about time that we freed up the informal economy. I think there's millions of females who live in that part of the economy, and all that we do is to block them from sort of parts of the city. We kind of drive them out of the main urban centers, and we allow them only to undertake their economic activity kind of outside of the mainstream of our economy. And I think it's about time that changed as well. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll be in trouble, so I'll stop there.
Good evening, colleagues and visitors. It seems a little strange to be making responses to the suit, the person that's not here. But let's have a go anyway. The phrase radical economic transformation has evoked a number of reactions, and I'm sure many of you sitting here can represent the spectrum of those. Irrespective of those contentions, I'd like to begin with the premise of my paper, and that is whether or not we hate the phrase or its origins, or whether we feel that it needs to be defended. The current debate about RET offers the opportunity to put economic justice on the public agenda. I want to make 3 points in my presentation this evening, and I deviated slightly from, quite a bit from the brief that David gave me in doing so. The first is that adding content to the phrase radical economic transformation is an unavoidable exercise. The second point that I want to make is that the ideological content must precede any action plan. And the third is that the content must surface as a social compact, the kind of social compact envisaged in the National Development Plan. So my first section is entitled, What's in a Name? Adding Content to Radical Economic Transformation. As it stands now, RET may not immediately be understood as a call to economic justice, although some proponents of it may argue that it is. To some, it's a radical notion of change. To others, a harbinger of racial tension, and still to others, a vague notion to rationalize state looting. Indeed, over the past few weeks, the language of RET has been replaced by its less contentious cousin, the term inclusive economic transformation. Despite the fact that the phrase has been the phrase RET has been part of populist rhetoric elsewhere in the world, common in many consultancy reports, in South Africa, the term has fallen out of favor since it was associated with the dubious business dealings of and alliances of Bell Pottinger. In addition, when it became clear during the ANC's policy conference that corruption would be the main threat to a radically economy, the phrase eventually faded into the background of economic, with our honorable minister arguing radical economic transformation. Deliberate investment into the content of the phrase made, not least in the public discourse. Since an interview by on EWN with Enoch Godongwana, the ANC's subcommittee chair on economic transformation. Stephen Crotus asked him about the term. I mean, everyone in society will have to which urge you know, to any finalization of any decision. I would imagine that once the phrase is whatever formulation that emerges, close quote. The point about adding content to an idea using the phrase non-racialism. The roots of the phrase and practice emerged, as David's book tells us, from activism of the SACP, the Liberal Party of South Africa, and other political formations. Yet, it became central to the language and the practice of the ANC in the 1970s. The term was invested with sometimes ambiguous meaning, some of non-racial membership of the ANC, solidarity, and seemed to be self-evident of the amongst the activists of the day. Even though scholars with different positions, so not amongst the Congress movement, had similar ideas about racial unity and solidarity, positions were never termed non-racialism, because non-racialism was a term dedicated to a particular political movement and a particular political moment. But as we know, in movements or within moments, they are floating signifiers, particularly if their meaning is not clear. Non-racialism more recently has been used by different political formations and as a guise for colorblindness and multiculturalism that only masks inequality. One public intellectual even labeled the phrase an anathema to the black body. So those phrases, like language, circulates through society, sometimes becoming so taken for granted that the original meanings become displaced, and sometimes they become invested by unintended meanings. It's a moment, the linguists tell us, of dispossession of the language, a capturing, if you will, of the original intent, or put another way, the reinvestment of unintended meaning by unintended actors to unintended ends. This is precisely why radical economic transformation needs to be invested with content. It is an unavoidable exercise if we are to have it as a noble principle guiding South Africa's economic trajectory, beyond terms of office and beyond party hegemony. But just what kind of content must we invest into the phrase, and who is the we that gets to invest with content? So the second point of the paper, ideological content must be a compass towards economic justice and precede its action plan. In a paper that considers transformation and reconciliation, Vusi Gumede suggests that while reconciliation requires radical transformation, a dialogue and consensus-based approach on the kind of economy the country requires should precede the practicalities of achieving that transformation. We must therefore consider the kind of economy our country requires, taking as its basis, of course, the kind of economy that we have. The existing norms of our economy are, on the one hand, accumulation, and the other, dispossession. On the one hand, crass and sometimes obscene consumption, and on the other, extreme indebtedness. On the one hand, dominance and exploitation, advantage, disadvantage, and uneven. In other words, what we do if we, without defining it, what we're trying to do through crude measures of redress is insert a greater number of people into the already untransformed bipolar economic system, which is fundamentally skewed by race. As some of the more poetic considerations of the NDP alludes to, this is neither transformative nor economically just. What is called for here is the reformatting of an economy. Ideological content must also include a commitment by the state to clean up its economic practice before any actual plan is on the table. Decry who break into government offices. There is large-scale dispossession of state funds. Recently highlighted irregular expenditure under the 260 billion rands, funds that could have provided almost 2 million houses or 1.1 full tertiary degrees, according to a study by members of civil society group in Save South Africa. The ideological content must include a commitment to responsible language and action. For example, our Honorable President recently called for young people, thank you, to be soldiers of RET. We cannot allow imprecise or populist language to run ahead of meticulous consideration of what we mean by it. The ideological content must also include consideration of the scale of our interventions, so that macroeconomic interventions, as important as they are not privileged over microeconomic interventions such as SMM accountability structures. For what will it profit South Africa to have the gains of big business trickle down so slowly, so unevenly, that all the while greater inequalities result in greater social fissure, greater disillusionment with the state, and racial hatred? To draw new ideological norms must be both retrospective, seeking to undo injustices of the past, and prospective, seeking to produce more just futures. These norms or values will serve as guiding principles to any actionable plan and as limits to the relentless quest for targets and indicators. These norms should outlast political office and transcend party politics. And my third and final and short point, the unapologetic imperative inscribed in the NDP as a social compact. The social compact is really asking something of someone. What are we asking, and of whom are we asking it? The social compact in the NDP speaks to the need to foster a compact relationship between state and society, where the collective commitments and action result in transformed societies. So, in the first instance, it's a compact between the state and its citizens, where capital is subservient to this relationship. Capital is subservient to the developmental imperatives of the nation, and where big business is held to account by both an economically literate and empowered public and a capable state to meet the demands of society. Vusi Gumede argues that the economy needs to serve the society. In the second instance, the social compact is asking something of the society itself, as a commitment to realize the just visions set out by policymakers. Earlier, we considered that the ideological must precede the practical. Political philosopher Samuel Scheffler's work allows us to think through what a social compact towards economic justice could mean for society at large, where commitment precedes action. Scheffler argues that when we pursue equality and economic justice, the ideological commitment needs to be relational equality. And this means at its very heart a reciprocal commitment to treating each other with respect, where the establishment of a society of equals is the governing principle. In other words, the commitment to relational equality as a social compact should precede distributive equality or tick box requirements for redress. Scheffler suggests that economic justice through redress and redistribution will necessarily flow easily from the establishment of the relational commitment to equality. Now, under this construct, there's no doubt that redistributive justice will ultimately require deliberate acts of constraint or significant financial cost or loss on the part of business or sections in society who benefit from historical patterns of wealth ownership, old wealth, as Pandi puts it. Yet, because the relational commitment is preeminent, distributive justice necessarily flows as a result of attitudes, dispositions, and practices of relational equality. The social compact, then, will be the kind of relational commitment that will guard against, as Ferial Hafaji puts it in her book, What If There Were No Whites in South Africa? It will guard against a situation where, in our pursuit for economic justice, someone is made to feel like a second-class citizen who does not enjoy the full spectrum of rights and responsibilities that our Constitution grants to each of us. In conclusion, unless we add content to the notion of RET, it remains an empty signifier, ready to be captured and used to varied and unpredictable ends. But the kind of content it calls for is not only programmatic, since action plans are time, politics, and locale bound. Instead, the kind of content called for is an ideological content or set of